Purposely. Your life, God's purpose. Listen at onpurposely.com.
Hey friend, I'm so glad you're here today. You're listening to the AllMomDoes podcast. Wanted to take a quick moment before we roll into the conversation that I'm really excited for you to hear, because we're going to be talking about a very adult topic that is absolutely impacting our churches, our marriages, ourselves so much. But we're going to be talking about the adult stuff, using the adult words and all the things. So please put on those earphones if you have little listening ears around. Just take a moment to grab that, and then I will meet you on the other side when we begin this conversation.
And so often we just want to say, just quit it, stop it, don't do that. God's not for that. But often people who want that freedom have promised themselves, they've promised God, they've promised others that they would never view pornography again. And they find themselves in this ongoing compulsive behavior. So how do people get stuck? I think that's a good place to start.
You're listening to the AllMomDoes podcast. I'm your host, Julie Lyles Carr. We're part of the Purposely Podcast Network. And we are going to be talking about a hot topic today, one in which we have seen numbers that we have never seen before, that definitely are having an impact on your community, maybe even your own marriage, maybe even your own faith walk. I am so glad to welcome Sam Black today to the podcast. He's the Director of Recovery Education for Covenant Eyes, and he's going to catch us up on the state of our hearts, the state of our churches, the state of our marriages when it comes to pornography. Sam, thank you so much for being with me today.
Julie, thank you so much. I know we're going to have a really good conversation, and maybe it sounds a little nervous for some of our listeners. Yeah, don't worry about that. We're going to have a really helpful, supportive, grace-filled, redeeming conversation here.
I love that. I love that you put that disclaimer up front because, this topic, Sam, and maybe this is actually part of the real deep issue. When we begin talking about pornography, there is such secretiveness and shame around it in many quarters within our faith communities. On the other hand, I'm also encountering people of faith who say, I don't understand why there's any problem with this. Like, we're just making this kind of part of our marriage experience. I've seen all spectrums of this. So catch me up on the latest information and statistics that you're seeing in the work that you do when it comes to pornography, when it comes to pornography use amongst believers.
Yeah, 2/3 of men, 1/3 of women in the church, they have an ongoing struggle with pornography. And when you dive a little deeper into that, 37% of men of all ages say that they are struggling. And when I say that, they're watching multiple times a week. Among men 18 to 30, 36% say they're watching it daily.
Wow.
When we look at women, 14% say they're watching at least weekly or more often. And so we can dive a little deeper into this. 26% of women said they watched in the last week. That's impactful. So how is this impacting us spiritually? And if we look at some not only Christian university studies, but secular university studies, we're finding that there's a direct correlation between pornography use and our scripture reading, our prayer life, our church attendance. All these things are being impacted. In fact, a University of Oklahoma study found that the more someone watched pornography, it was directly related to how much they might serve on a committee or a volunteer role in their church over the next 6 years. So it's really having an impact on us on mind, body, and spirit. And sometimes we negate this a lot, right? We negate this. Is it really having an impact? Well, these studies are showing it is. And as well, when I just recently spoke at my church, and you probably hear this wood chipper going on in the background right now. You're probably hearing some of that. If you bear with us, and we'll continue on. But I spoke recently at my own church, and afterward, a man joined me, and I also serve as a coach, a certified coach on this topic, and he goes, I really didn't realize how much this was impacting my wife, how it made her feel, and how it was impacting my relationship, the way I thought and just beginning to really unravel this. This is the first time I've heard someone really speak on this topic. He's new to our church, and so he's like, I've got to make a change, because once you begin pulling back the veil, all the little excuses and all the little, justifications, they start to seem pretty shallow. So when we dig deeper, that's when we have some better discovery about how this is impacting me personally as an individual, how it's impacting my relationships, how it's impacting my marriage, how it's impacting my spiritual life. And pornography creates this detonation zone. It's one of the reasons Paul in Corinthians talks so about how when we sin sexually, we take sin into our own bodies, that it's impacting us. Well, that impacts us very specifically, but it also impacts how we view everyone around us. It impacts how we relate to our spouse. It impacts how we relate to our kids, our society, our work life. And so there's also this detonation zone. And, in 56% of divorce cases today, a major contributing factor is one person's ongoing use or compulsive use of pornography.
Wow, I had not heard that statistic. And before you and I jumped onto recording this interview, we were chatting ahead of time, and I shared with you that one of the things that I often had, kind of a funny conversation, but there's someone who I just adore, who was a colleague when I was a women's pastor at my local church where I was on staff. We would have conversations in which we were talking about the guy's use of pornography, but then, new information and new research was showing that women's pornography use was climbing dramatically. And I was definitely seeing this and seeing the effect of it within the women that I was leading. I like that you connect the dots, that this is not sort of just a one compartmentalized, just little thing that somebody does here over to the side, that it creates ripple effects across family, community, and on and on and on. And we're talking specifically about what happens within someone's church world and how they are interacting in that church world. But I've also known individuals that the level of their addiction became so significant that it was impacting their employment. It was impacting what they were doing on the job. It was impacting the time they were taking for physical health. I mean, it just kept proliferating out in a way that was really amazing, not in a good way, but amazing to see, to realize how many areas of life that it was impacting. Now, I know for a lot of people, they feel kind of stuck in their pornography use. They may have been connecting some dots and going, I don't think this is the best. I realize this might be having some impact on my marriage or some of my personal habits, but they feel really stuck. And I don't feel like that in terms of what we're offering at the local church level, we're really doing a whole lot to help people. Part of it is because I think of the reduced conversations that we often have around sexual issues when it comes to our faith communities. But also I think a lot of leaders don't know what to say and what to do. So in the work that you're doing, how are you trying to equip faith leaders to understand what happens next? We look at these stats, they're alarming. Now what do we do?
Well, thank you, Julie. That's the main reason I wrote The Healing Church, what churches get wrong about pornography and how to fix it. You can find the book wherever you buy books online, at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. By the way, it's got 5 stars on both of those.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I really wanted to, in writing the book, I've been at Covenant Eyes for 17 years, and I heard this over and over again from people who had found their way through the trap, the stronghold of pornography, coming out on the other side and finding real and lasting freedom. And they would say, you know what? My church didn't help me very much. Well, the church is God's plan A. That's where we're supposed to be. We are the body of Christ to one another. And we look at Galatians 6 and it says, gently correct you who are spiritual faithful, you who are spiritually mature. Well, my goodness, that's not, it wasn't a good idea that Paul suggested. He said, do this. You got to do this. If you're spiritually mature, you need to be helping others who are struggling. And then he, right after that, talks about this reaping and sowing, that when we sow to the flesh, we're going to reap fleshly impact. When we sow to the Spirit, we're also going to do that as well. And so then he hops right back right after that and says, listen, you who are spiritually mature, don't grow weary of helping those, especially to those who are in the faith. So we are called, as when we come out on the other side of this, or as we who are spiritually mature, maybe we've never struggled with this. So we need to understand, how do people get stuck? Why do they often stay stuck without help? And how can we provide meaningful support? And so often we just want to say, just quit it, stop it, don't do that. God's not for that. But often people who want that freedom have promised themselves, they've promised God, they've promised others that they would never view pornography again. And they find themselves in this ongoing compulsive behavior. So how do people get stuck? I think that's a good place to start. We find three common factors in the histories of people who struggle deeply. One, early exposure to pornography as a child. Number two, the ongoing use and repetition with pornography, typically in adolescence. Number three, some trauma, some pain that's happened often at a young age, but could happen elsewhere as well. We know that pornography is so impactful on a young brain. The brain for a child is the feeling part of the brain and the excitement part of the brain. The reward center of the brain is very well developed for children as well as teenagers, who are even more excited by that. Or by anything that provides excitement to the reward centers of the brain. But the prefrontal cortex, that decision-making, executive functioning part of the brain, doesn't fully develop until the late 20s. So it's very hard for a child to look away from pornography, even if they don't understand what they're looking at. I have found that most people, most adults, if they were exposed to pornography as a child, can tell you a complete story about the first time that they saw pornography, even though they can't tell you anything else about that day. I was 10 years old. I remember walking out of my home in Florida, and my brother, who was 10 years older than me, was leaning against his car with his friend, and they were looking at a magazine sideways, and that didn't make any sense. How can you read sideways? And I asked them what they were looking at, and they turned it around, and I didn't turn away. I was naturally curious, like all children are naturally curious about what the opposite sex looks like without clothes. So I stepped forward. Now, I can't tell you anything else about that day, but dopamine fires off when those cues are picked up, even though I didn't even understand the basic mechanics of sexuality. I didn't know about the birds and the bees. All I knew was something awakened in my brain that I didn't quite understand, and I was naturally curious and stepped forward. It was so impactful that I told you a full story about it.
Right.
Now, I also had a friend, and his dad had pornography that was falling out of his closet. If you could imagine this shelf of pornography that was sort of stacked, and it was leaning over, and much of it had fallen on the floor, and I could take anything I wanted, and I did. So the repetition began happening, and so pornography would begin following me through adolescence. Now, one of the reasons that I found that I escaped more with pornography, a very common thing, was that even though I came from a Christian home, my father was a hypocritically violent, raging person. And so when I felt fear or frustration and anger, I didn't realize that I was using pornography as an escape, a salve that would just allow me to feel some numbness from what was going on around me. So pornography then would follow me from middle school to high school to college into my marriage. But thankfully, I had a healing church that came alongside me. My wife had asked me if I would go to church with her, and she was taking our babies, they were just babies then, to our church, and she said, there's this marriage class going on, and I knew our marriage needed some help, and so I agreed to go with her. And these were peculiar people. They would, the facilitators of the class would close the door, look back at the class and say, this is a safe place, and what is said here stays here. Well, in that environment, those people talked about the horrible things they said to their spouse and the things they were thinking and doing and the things they were doing to rupture their marriage. But also within that honesty, that is where I discovered that pornography could be compulsive and addictive, and that was a great relief, because that meant I didn't have to stay this way. God didn't make me this way from a spiritual perspective. Evolution didn't make me this way from a secular perspective. I could be free.
Right.
And with some other men, I got to take a journey step by step to learn to live in freedom from pornography.
I think it's amazing and so important to point out that these neural pathways get laid. They just begin to create an easier and easier on-ramp every time. And one of the things that I love that you address, because I think it's a misnomer to think that this is an issue that is only today or only plaguing today because of the devices, the easy access that we have. Of course we have that. But just to your point, when I was a kid growing up in Southern California, we had all of this land around us, which was the high desert. And I can very clearly remember, exactly to your point, going out into the desert, and we would build these forts. Now I say forts, we would dig trenches around the Joshua trees because the root systems would go really deep. And so we all had these different forts, I'm using air quotes, around these Joshua trees, which sounds pretty bleak actually when I talk about it, but it seemed amazing when I was a kid. Well, one day, sure enough, in one of these forts, somebody had stashed some adult magazines. And then there was the house that I was house sitting for and watering their plants, and they had it in their house. So there were still opportunities, absolutely, when I was a kid, when all of us were younger, even though we didn't have devices that had it readily available. And so to understand that this is not something that is just happened in the last 10 or 20 years, that this is something that has been an ongoing issue for a huge amount of time, and the way we respond to it and the lack of response at times within our faith communities is so important. I always say it's not if your kids are going to see this content. It's when. And how have you prepared them to understand what's going on, why they're going to be drawn to it without shame, with just letting them know this is something you're going to encounter in this world. It's going to create these kind of feelings. Let's have an open communication about it. I think that's really powerful. Sam, I love that you were in a church situation that allowed you to explore this. I mean, because, I have a colleague whom I respect so much. He is a very, very gifted marriage and family counselor. He was on staff with a church, and this just happened just a few years ago. They had a marriage class. He was using adult words for adult situations in a space that he had told this class would be a safe space. And church leadership ended up targeting him and firing him for talking about some of these very issues, which was stunning to me. I thought, we are in the 21st century with some 21st century issues going on. How can we be still acting like this, being so precious about adult topics and adult words in an adult married Bible class, when we know statistically there are people in there who absolutely need the information, like what you encountered in your class? How do we get past some of this land of preciousness, puritanical, like how do we do it and do it well, where we're still honoring what God intended to be valuable, and yet at the same time to not act like we can't ever talk about it or it's offensive? And it's just, what a cauldron. How to help us out of there, Sam. It's probably one of the number one questions I get being a mom of 8 kids. And that question is, what on earth are y'all doing about college? And I can tell you, with 8 different kids, 8 different learning styles, 8 different ideas about what the kids want when it comes to their careers and all of the rest, college has been a big topic of conversation around here. Well, there is a university that I want you to know about because it just hits so many of the things that are really important when it comes to considering your kids' college education. George Fox University It's the #1 private school in Oregon. It's a Christian university. It's located in the heart of the Pacific Northwest. And what's so great is, in addition to a top-notch education, students have the opportunity to grow and deepen their faith, and they can learn in this really pivotal time in their lives who God made them to be. I mean, let's face it, we need more people coming out of our universities who know how to be leaders and how to be leaders with character. And George Fox University offers more than 60 academic majors. And that includes a nationally recognized engineering program, a nursing program. It allows your student to pursue their passions and prepare for the calling that God has for them. And let's not forget about fun when it comes to college. George Fox University students have a great student life. There are weekly campus events, there's chapel, there's service opportunities. There are 23 NCAA Division III athletic teams. Here's something that is important to me. There's a study abroad opportunity. So if your student wants to go and experience life somewhere else for a semester, they can do that. There's outdoor recreation because, of course, we're talking about Oregon, so gorgeous. George Fox University could be just the perfect fit for your student as you are looking into college, career, and all that goes beyond. George Fox University, where your student will learn and thrive in the center of it all.
Yeah, it's so difficult. I remember a pastor telling me, says, "Now, let me get this right, Sam. You want me to begin having these conversations within my church, even from the pulpit, talking about these types of things when, the kids are in their classrooms, etc. But you want me to talk about these kinds of issues? Sam, I was reading scripture and talking about Jericho." Julie, you're hitting it spot on when you say that sometimes we don't have the maturity to talk about these topics in the church. We need to be able to do this. I remember talking to a pastor, and he was talking about, hey, I'm reading scripture, and we're talking about Rahab, and it calls her a prostitute in the Bible. And afterwards, some little ladies came up to me and said, hey, you cannot use language like that. And it's like, wait, I'm reading from scripture. What should I have told them? You're saying I should be talking about pornography and these things in the church, and now I'm getting this kind of kickback? What would you have said? I'd said, well, tell them to grow up. We need to grow up, right? Our culture isn't ashamed to talk about these things. We're seeing this. Our kids have more access to more of the most inappropriate content ever before in human history. We're carrying around with us in our pockets the largest library of pornography ever created in the history of mankind, and we're often giving these devices to our kids. And so I think it's imperative as parents that we recognize there's often 5 myths we believe. One is my kid is a good kid and they would never be curious like I was curious, like you were curious, right? Number 2, we miss the impact of that, how impactful it is on the brain. Number 2, if my kid did see something, well, they just look away because they're good kids and we think the world of our kids, but we miss again how impactful that is. Number 3, the measures I have in place are good enough. And typically what that means is we're looking over their shoulder when they have a device out, but we're really not monitoring or filtering or having protective tools on those devices. And number 4, I don't have to worry about my girls. I only have to worry about boys.
Yeah.
I remember a 15-year-old girl coming up to the Covenant Eyes table, and she says, I brought my mom and dad here to sign up for Covenant Eyes because when I was 8, I heard some boys say some words I didn't understand. And so I asked my dad for his phone, and I looked up those words, and that was the first time that I saw pornography. It was so impactful, and I didn't understand why it was so impactful on me, that I would go back routinely, multiple times a week, and ask my mom and dad for their devices because they didn't allow me to have my own. And I would use their device to look at pornography and was smart enough to hide my tracks when I got done. That went on for 2 years before, by accident, they discovered what I was doing.
Wow.
So let's worry about our girls too, especially that early exposure. Number 5, if I talk about it, I will just make them curious and they'll go search for more. That's myth number 5. Throughout, professionals throughout this industry will say meaningful, supportive, non-shaming conversations will help your kids be more resilient to pornography, and you will actually be enlisting them into helping you protect them. Now, there's a cool little book that you can get. I don't get anything for recommending it, but it's called Good Pictures, Bad Pictures Junior. There's other books that go along with this series, but you start with this book at a young age. How young? As soon as they're old enough to be able to talk, and they need to, again, be able to name their body parts by correct names, not nicknames. I had done work with the trafficking and task forces in Michigan, etc. And I've had state police say, listen, we couldn't prosecute because the child couldn't talk about their own body. Mm-hmm. They didn't have the words. They didn't have vocabulary to talk about what was happening. So we need to let them know the names of their correct body parts. And this Good Pictures, Bad Pictures book, Junior, will help them know pornography from what is not pornography. So yes, they're going to learn the word pornography, but this is how it works. You open up the book, and the book talks about good pictures of our family and our pets and all the things that we enjoy. And when we go on vacation, we go to the beach and we wear our bathing suits. Now they understand where their bathing suit area is and why that's private. Now they're learning to protect themselves even from sexual assault. And, when we see a picture or video without the bathing suit area covered, that's pornography. And we can turn, run, and tell. Turn, run, and tell. And that gets repeated. And the more you read the book and do it, and kids have no reservations about this. They're not embarrassed by it. They think, I'm going to need to turn, run, and tell. So a mom has followed this advice after I had spoken at an event. And the next year I'm speaking there again. And she comes running up to me and goes, Sam, I just had to tell you, my 7-year-old son was just exposed to pornography. And I was like, yay.
Yeah.
I don't think this is good, is it?
Yeah.
Am I going to get hit by a purse here? I don't know what's going to go on. So she says, no, you don't understand. See, my 7-year-old son went to my neighbor's house, and their 7-year-old son had just received an iPad for his birthday. And he takes that device, and he because he's found pornography, and he pushes it at my son's face, and he says, look what I found. And he goes, the son who's been trained goes, no, that's pornography. And he turns, runs, and tells. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that equipping is so important.
They can congratulate him. They're excited.
Yeah.
But they let the other parents know what happened. With a little more investigation, those parents find that their 7-year-old son has shown pornography to kids throughout the neighborhood, 7, 8, 9, and 11-year-olds. The only child who said anything was the child who had been trained.
Right.
All the other kept it their secret.
I love that child was equipped with the tools he would need to understand what to do when faced with this. Because again, as we said, it's not an if, it's a when a child's going to stumble onto this. And sometimes it is the kid next door. And the ability to know what to do, to pre-decide, to practice ahead of time what the response will be. And the door that mom and dad opened up for that child to feel that they could say that, I think is so powerful. Sure. Sam, how do we, if we discover that our spouse is grappling with this kind of addiction? I can see two scenarios here. One is as a spouse, one is as a parent, and I want to ask you about both of those. Yes. If we discover in our marriage that this is an issue, if a husband discovers his wife is routinely using this, if a wife discovers that her husband is routinely using this, and I want to throw in here too, there's a whole level that's happening, particularly for women, that's quite interesting, which is a level in publishing we've never seen before. We think of pornography as just the images, but there is a whole line of writing today.
Sure.
Books that are available, those kinds of things that are extremely explicit. And the argument could be made, well, those aren't images. Are we still talking about the same thing? And I think to some degree, we got to go, come on. We're talking about some of the same stuff here. How should a spouse begin to approach this? There's the understandable initial impact of potentially feeling betrayed, of feeling hurt, of wondering what other secrets are out there. But how do we approach this kind of discovery from the most healthy place that we can?
Julie, that is such an important question and topic, because we need to provide support to our spouses, and often they don't receive much support in the church. And that's hurtful. That's painful. They're having to walk along this journey, often on their own. So sometimes, if the church does anything, they're likely focused on the person who's struggling with pornography, whether that's a man or a woman. But the spouse doesn't really receive any support. They're just like, hey, you need to forgive and forget and move on. And things it's not very helpful.
Right.
So we need some tools that I believe would help. And one thing that I did within the Healing Church, what churches get wrong about pornography and how to fix it, was I invited Dr. Sherry Keffer to write one of the chapters in the book to help ministry leaders understand how impactful this is on the spouse, how it impacts them physically and spiritually and mentally and relationally, how they relate to the church. All this is very impactful on that person. And so it's imperative that we have these kind of conversations, and we need to provide some resources, not only to ministry leaders, but to spouses. There is Dr. Sherry Keffer's book. I've got it handy here. It's called Intimate Deception. And she does just such a wonderful job, having walked through her own journey. And that's why I invited her to write a chapter in the book. But this is a deep topic. We could spend another 2 or 3 shows just covering this issue alone.
Right.
And so I really encourage you, pick up a copy of The Healing Church or pick up Intimate Deception and understand how this is impacting you personally, and what are the next steps that you could really take, not only for someone else's healing, but for your own healing as well.
I'm so glad that you pointed that out, because so often when it comes to addiction cycles, whether that is something like pornography, alcohol, drugs, whatever the thing is, we do get focused on the person who is suffering with the addiction, and that's appropriate and needed. But the impact on a spouse is so significant. And so within our faith communities, to remain really vigilant, to make sure that that spouse is seen, heard, understood, resourced.
Yes.
That's such a great thing for us to keep in mind, Sam. Thank you for that. If mom and dad discover that their kiddo is the one who's been the porn peddler around the neighborhood, showing all the other kids in the neighborhood from the iPad, how do they begin that conversation with that child to, again, not introduce some huge level of shame, but to try to get to the core, to understand, and to help that child heal, because that child's got some neural pathways that have been laid down now that could lead to some really tough things. So how do mom and dad, they get the phone call and, they find out that their kid's been the one to show this off. What do they do next?
Julie, that is so important for us to be able to have conversations that are non-shaming, that are helping a child navigate that, because the first inclination might be our own personal shame. Our child did this. How do we look in our neighborhood? How do we look in our church?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
This is an embarrassment. And so we adopt some of this shame. And maybe we've had our own struggle with pornography, and that's causing some additional shame. Maybe we've endured some sexual abuse or something else happened that even causes, oh no, my child is part of the abuse that I endured. It might also be that I can't understand why anyone would ever look at something like this. This is so disgusting. How could it be, so the revulsion of that, now you're throwing all that onto a child who's doesn't have the prefrontal cortex, again,
right.
that's fully developed, doesn't have your years of experience. And so our job is to equip and train our kids, right? So we need to have non-shaming conversations around this topic. And sometimes, and why is that? I often tell parents, if you want to teach your child to view pornography more, then shame them.
Right. You're going to drive them toward it. Yeah.
You're going to, that shame is self-hatred at my expense. And so they'll pull in that shame into their heart, and they will try to escape. But the more they try to pull away from it, the more that shaming says, I need that attended. Pain must be attended. So I will don't want to do this. I feel bad about myself, but now I begin entering the cycle of addiction or compulsive behavior with pornography. Don't shame your child because you'll just teach them to hide better.
Right.
All right. So how can we begin having this conversation? Well, Covenant Eyes has a great resource. You can find it at covenanteyes.com/resources. Again, that's covenanteyes.com/resources. And it's a book called Confident, Helping Parents Navigate Online Exposure. It walks them right through how do we have this conversation. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have tools that can help and do that. It may be imperative for you to understand how people get stuck in pornography in the first place, why it can be so impactful. And that can help both for your kids, for someone in your church that you may be willing to walk alongside and be supportive for. Maybe it's going to be helping your own marriage. Maybe it's for yourself personally. So Covenant Eyes has this app called Victory by Covenant Eyes, and within it are more than 35 courses that help people understand how do you get stuck, why do people stay stuck without help, and how can we find lasting freedom. There's also courses in there about how to be a good ally to someone else, also courses about how do we have a safe disclosure with a safe process. What's been going on that I don't know about, instead of playing cop and being an investigator, how can we have a healthy discussion about this and everything comes out on the table with some support?
I love that.
How does I as a spouse, how can I begin navigating this for myself, my own healing journey? What does that look like? Again, all those courses in there are free. Download the Victory app by Covenant Eyes to your devices.
What an amazing resource. Thank you so much for letting us know about that. Well, Sam, what a great conversation. The Healing Church, what churches get wrong about pornography and how to fix it. Where can the listener go to find out more about you? And we'll make sure that we get all of these great resources you've mentioned in the show notes. Rebecca puts those together every week, and that's a great place to go and find all the things that Sam's been talking about. But where can a listener go and find you online, all the places?
Sure. There's thehealingchurch.com, of course, for the book. It has a little more about me as well. You can also find me at covenanteyes.com and some blogs, et cetera, that I've written there. But if you need to reach out and you're saying, hey, Sam, I need to point me towards some additional resources specifically for this, or we need you to come and speak, or what have you, just reach out to me directly, sam.black@covenanteyes.com. Again, that's sam.black, I like the color, at covenanteyes.com.
Perfect. Well, Sam, again, thank you so much for your time today. I have to laugh because I feel like sometimes some of the most important conversations that we have on the podcast are accentuated by things like roofers showing up across the street or wood chippers showing up outside your window. And I had it happen on an interview just a couple weeks ago. It was a wood chipper outside my window. So I don't know exactly what that's all about in the spiritual, but I appreciate your tenacity and staying in the lane, and for the listener continuing to take in this great information. Sam Black, thank you again so much for being on the show.
Julie, honored to be here with you. Thank you.
All right, listener, you can go find out more in the show notes. I want to thank Rebecca. She's so great to put those together. And while you're there, be sure and check out AllMomDoes, AllMomDoes.com, AllMomDoes on the socials. It's a community where you're going to find a lot of support and other women who are walking through the journey of life and the seasons and the stages that you're at. So be sure and check that out. I love it too when you come say hi to me over on the socials, mainly on Instagram, Julie Lyles Carr. And I'll see you next time on the AllMomDoes podcast.
Yeah.